Sometimes the heart finds what it needs in the most unexpected places. Sometimes love grows where even strong men fall. In 1892, 3 workers collapsed trying to harvest the wheat at Red Hollow Ranch in Montana. When Annie Rose Dillard, a small woman with worn boots, asked for the job, everyone laughed. But Colter Hayes, the widowed ranch owner, gave her a chance. She worked harder than any man, humming hymns while her hands bled, mending his clothes when he wasn't looking. When storms threatened the crop, she saved the harvest. But when the county offered to buy his land, would their love be strong enough to save the ranch? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted Red Hollow Ranch in shades of amber and rust, stretching long shadows across wheat fields that rolled like golden waves toward the distant mountains. Colter Hayes stood on his front porch, coffee steaming in the chipped ceramic mug that had been Sarah's favorite, watching the day begin as he had for the past 5 years since her passing. The silence that had once felt companionable now pressed against him like a weight he couldn't shake. At 42, Colter carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had learned that words were often less valuable than actions. His hands, scarred from years of ranch work, bore the calluses of honest labor, and his weathered face told stories of Montana winters and summer harvests. The silver wedding ring on his left hand caught the early light, a reminder he couldn't bring himself to remove, though Sarah had been gone long enough that the grief had settled into something more like a persistent ache. Red Hollow Ranch had been in the Hayes family for 3 generations. Colter's grandfather had claimed this land when it was nothing but prairie grass and wild hope, building the first cabin with timber hauled from the mountains. His father had expanded it, adding the barn and the fields that now stretched across 200 acres of prime Montana soil. Colter had inherited not just the land, but the responsibility that came with it, the knowledge that every decision he made would echo through generations yet to come. The ranch house itself reflected decades of patient building and careful maintenance. 2 stories of solid timber construction with a wraparound porch that caught the evening breeze and morning sun in equal measure. Sarah had planted climbing roses along the railings, and though Colter tended them with dutiful care, they seemed to bloom less enthusiastically each passing year. Inside, the house retained the warmth Sarah had brought to it, quilts she had sewn, furniture they had chosen together, photographs that captured happier times when laughter had filled these rooms. The wheat fields were the heart of the operation, acre upon acre of golden grain that waved in the morning breeze like nature's own prayer flags. This year's crop promised to be exceptional if they could bring it in before the autumn storms arrived. That was proving more challenging than Colter had anticipated. 3 workers had already failed. Under the demanding conditions, Tom Bradley had collapsed from heat exhaustion on the 2nd day, requiring Doc Morrison to be summoned from town. Jake Willerton had lasted a week before admitting the work was beyond his capabilities. Most recently, Dutch Hanrahan, a man known throughout the territory for his strength and endurance, had simply walked away after 4 days, shaking his head and muttering about impossible expectations. The remaining ranch hand-sold Pete Garrison, who had worked for Colter's father, and the younger Wilson twins, Matt and Mark, were good men, but aging. Pete's arthritis troubled him more each season, though he would never admit it. The twins, now in their 30s, had families of their own and divided loyalties. They worked with dedication, but Colter could see the concern in their eyes when they looked at the vast fields waiting to be harvested. Colter's own concerns ran deeper than the immediate challenge of bringing in the crop. The ranch's finances, while not dire, were tight enough to make him lose sleep. The banknote his father had taken out to expand the operation still carried a balance that required careful management. Feed costs had risen, and the price of wheat, while stable, hadn't increased enough to offset other expenses. Every failed worker meant lost time and money they couldn't afford to waste. The sound of wagon wheels on gravel interrupted his morning contemplation. A supply wagon from town approached, driven by Fred Hutchinson, who made the weekly run bringing mail, supplies, and occasionally new workers seeking employment. But this morning, something was different. Instead of the usual collection of rough men hoping for harvest work, a single figure sat beside Fred on the wagon, seat small, slight, wearing clothes that had seen better days but were clean and carefully mended. As the wagon drew closer, Coulter could make out more details. The newcomer was a woman, perhaps in her late 20s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun and freckles scattered across a face that spoke of time spent outdoors. Her clothing was simply faded blue dress, sturdy boots that had walked many miles, and a worn canvas jacket that suggested someone accustomed to hard work and uncertain weather. Fred brought the wagon to a halt near the porch steps, tipping his hat to Coulter. "Morning, Coulter. Got someone here asking about harvest work." The woman climbed down from the wagon with an economy of movement that suggested both grace and practicality. She approached the porch with steady steps, her chin raised slightly, as if preparing for a challenge she had faced before. When she spoke, her voice carried a slight accent, perhaps from back east, though softened by time and travel. "Mr. Hayes, I'm Annie Rose Dillard. I heard in town you might have work available bringing in your harvest." Coulter studied her face, noting the determination in her green eyes and the set of her jaw that suggested a stubborn streak. Her hands, he observed, were not soft. They bore the calluses and small scars of someone who had worked with tools and knew the price of labor. "Miss Dillard," he replied, his voice neutral, "I appreciate you coming out, but the work we have available is demanding. Physical labor in difficult conditions. 3 men have already found it more than they could handle." Annie's expression didn't change. "I understand, Mr. Hayes. I've done harvest work before. I know what it entails." From the barn area, Pete Garrison approached, curiosity evident on his weathered face. The Wilson twins emerged from the equipment shed, tools in hand, their conversation dying as they noticed the newcomer. Coulter could read their skepticism. Clearly they had seen the strong men who had failed, and they were wondering what this slip of a woman thought she could accomplish. "Where have you worked harvest before?" Coulter asked, genuine curiosity overriding his initial doubt. "Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado," Annie replied without hesitation. "Spent 3 seasons working the wheat fields around Dodge City, 2 more in the cornfields north of Lincoln. I can handle a scythe, bundle grain, load wagons, and work from dawn to dusk without complaint." Pete stepped closer, his expression thoughtful. "Begging your pardon, miss, but this here harvest has broken some good men. The heat's been fierce, and the wheat's thick as I've ever seen it. It's back-breaking work, and we're racing against time before the weather turns." Annie turned to meet Pete's gaze directly. "I understand your concern, Mr. Garrison, Pete Garrison. Mr. Garrison, I know I don't look like much compared to the men who came before me, but I've learned that strength isn't always about size, and endurance isn't always about muscle. Sometimes it's about refusing to quit when quitting would be easier." The quiet conviction in her voice gave Coulter pause. There was something in her manner that reminded him of his grandmother, a woman who had helped build this ranch when it was nothing but hope and determination. His grandmother had been small too, but she had possessed an inner toughness that had seen the family through droughts, harsh winters, and economic hardships that would have broken lesser spirits. "The pay is $2 a day, plus meals and a place to sleep in the bunkhouse," Coulter said, surprising himself with the decision even as he spoke it. "Work starts at dawn and ends when the light fails. Sunday is a half day for rest and laundry. If you can't keep pace, there's no shame in saying so, but I can't afford to carry anyone who isn't pulling their weight." Annie nodded. "That's fair, Mr. Hayes. I won't disappoint you." "Fred," Coulter called to the wagon driver, "if you'll wait a moment, I'll have Pete show Miss Dillard to the bunkhouse and get her settled." Fred touched his hat brim. "No hurry, Coulter. Good luck to you, miss," he added to Annie with a kindly smile. As Pete led Annie toward the bunkhouse, Coulter found himself watching her walk. There was purpose in her stride, a sense of someone who had learned to carry herself with confidence even when facing uncertainty. The Wilson twins exchanged glances and shook their heads, but they returned to their work without comment. The bunkhouse was a simple but sturdy building that housed the seasonal workers. Pete showed Annie to a small room at the end that offered privacy and a window facing the mountains. The furnishings were sparsely narrow bed, a washstand, a chest for belongings, but everything was clean and functional. Meals are at sunrise, noon, and sunset, Pete explained. Martha comes in from town to cook for us during harvest season. She's a good woman, and her cooking will keep your strength up. Laundry can be done at the creek Sunday mornings, and there's soap in the supply room. Annie set her single carpet bag on the bed and turned to Pete with a smile. Thank you for the kindness, Mr. Garrison. I know this situation is unusual. Pete studied her for a moment, then smiled in return. I've learned not to judge too quickly, miss. This land has a way of surprising you. Coulter's a good man, fair as they come. You work honest for him, and he'll treat you right. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Coulter sat on his porch, as was his custom, reviewing the day and planning for tomorrow. The sounds of the ranch settling into evening surrounded him, cattle lowing in the distance, the soft nickering of horses in the corral, the rustle of wind through the wheat. Annie emerged from the bunkhouse, having changed into work clothes for the morning, sturdy trousers, a cotton shirt, and boots that looked ready for serious labor. She walked to the fence line and stood looking out over the wheat fields, her hands resting on the top rail. Something about her stillness caught Coulter's attention. She wasn't just looking at the fields, she was studying them, reading the lay of the land and the condition of the crop with the eye of someone who understood agriculture. After several minutes, she turned and walked back toward the bunkhouse, pausing when she noticed him on the porch. It's beautiful land, Mr. Hayes, she called softly. You must be proud of what your family has built here. Thank you, he replied, surprised by the observation. Most workers saw only the labor ahead of them, not the generations of careful stewardship that had created this place. I'll be ready at dawn, Annie said, and disappeared into the bunkhouse. Coulter remained on the porch as full darkness settled over the ranch. In the distance, he could hear Pete and the Wilson twins talking quietly outside the main bunkhouse, their voices carrying the skepticism he had expected. Tomorrow would tell the tale. Either Annie Rose Dillard would prove herself capable of the work, or she would join the list of those who had found Red Hollow's harvest beyond their capabilities. What surprised him was how much he found himself hoping she would succeed. As he finally rose to go inside, Coulter's fingers unconsciously turned the wedding ring on his hand, a gesture that had become habit over the years. Tonight, for reasons he couldn't quite name, the ring felt different. Not lighter, exactly, but less like a chain binding him to the past, and more like a bridge between what had been and what might yet come to be. Inside the house, Sarah's presence lingered in every room, her books on the shelves, her sewing basket by the window, her apron still hanging on its hook by the kitchen door. But tonight, as Coulter prepared for bed, he found himself thinking not of the past, but of the morning ahead and the small woman who had looked at his fields with the eyes of someone who understood that wheat was more than grain, it was hope made manifest in golden waves that caught the wind and whispered of harvests yet to come. The night was clear and cool, promising good weather for the work ahead. In the bunkhouse, Annie Rose Dillard fell asleep to the sound of wind through wheat, her last conscious thought a prayer of gratitude for the chance to prove herself worthy of honest work, and, perhaps, something more than the wandering life that had brought her to this place, where the mountains met the sky, and a stubborn man with kind eyes was willing to give her the opportunity she had been seeking for longer than she cared to. Remember. Dawn came early to Red Hollow Ranch, painting the sky in shades of pearl and rose before the sun crested the mountains. Annie Rose Dillard was already dressed and waiting by the equipment shed when Coulter emerged from the house, coffee in hand and uncertainty in his heart. The morning air carried the sweet scent of ripening wheat and the promise of another scorching day. Pete Garrison arrived first, followed by the Wilson twins, all three men moving with the resigned efficiency of workers who had seen too many hopeful beginners fail in the first few hours. They nodded to Annie politely, but kept their distance, their skepticism as thick as morning fog. "Morning, Miss Dillard," Coulter said, studying her face for signs of second thoughts. "Ready for what lies ahead?" Annie adjusted the worn leather gloves on her hands gloves that had seen countless seasons of hard work, their palms smooth from years of gripping tool handles. The leather was cracked in places and mended with careful stitches, telling a story of persistence through hardship. "I'm ready, Mr. Hayes." Coulter led the group to the eastern fields where the wheat stood tallest and thickest. The grain rose nearly to Annie's shoulders, golden heads heavy with kernels that caught the early light like scattered jewels. This was the section that had defeated the previous worker's acre upon acre of dense growth that required constant cutting, bundling, and hauling under the relentless Montana sun. "We work in teams," Coulter explained, handing Annie a sharp scythe. "Cut clean, bundle tight, and keep moving. The sun will be fierce by mid-morning, and we need to make good progress before the heat becomes unbearable." Annie tested the weight of the scythe, running her thumb along the blade's edge with the practiced touch of someone who understood tools. She nodded and took her position at the field's edge, waiting for the signal to begin. The work started in silence, broken only by the rhythmic whisper of blades cutting through grain. Annie moved with surprising grace, her scythe describing perfect arcs that left clean stubble in her wake. While the men worked with brute force, she employed technique, wangling her cuts for maximum efficiency, using her whole body to power each stroke rather than relying solely on arm strength. By mid-morning, when the sun had climbed high enough to turn the air shimmering, a clear pattern had emerged. Annie was not only keeping pace with the others, she was working with a steady rhythm that never faltered. While Pete stopped frequently to rest his aching back, and the Wilson twins paused to wipe sweat from their brows, Annie continued her methodical progress, humming softly under her breath. The melody she hummed was an old hymn, "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing," and somehow the familiar tune made the back-breaking work seem more bearable. Even Pete found himself unconsciously timing his strokes to her rhythm. "Where did you learn to work like that?" Matt Wilson asked during the noon break, genuine curiosity replacing his earlier skepticism. Annie wiped her face with a kerchief, leaving streaks in the dust that coated her skin. "My father," she said simply, "he taught me that hard work was a conversation between your hands and the task, not a fight to be won with force." She paused, her gaze distant. "He used to say that wheat had its own rhythm, and if you listened carefully, it would tell you how it wanted to be cut." Coulter, who had been watching her work with growing amazement, heard something in her voice that made him pay closer attention. There was grief there, carefully controlled, but unmistakable to someone who had carried his own burden of loss. "Your father was a farmer?" he asked gently. Annie nodded, her fingers working absently at a tear in her glove, where the leather had finally given way under the morning's strain. "Had a place along the Platte River in Nebraska. 160 acres of the finest bottomland you ever saw. Corn mostly, but wheat too when the prices were right." "Had." Pete's weathered face showed understanding. "Flood took it 3 years ago," Annie said, her voice steady but her hands stilling on the glove. "Spring rains had been heavy, but we'd seen high water before. This time was different. River changed course overnight, took the house, the barn, the fields, took my family too." The silence that followed was heavy with shared understanding. Every person who worked the land knew that nature gave and took with equal indifference, and that the line between prosperity and disaster was often thinner than morning frost. "I'm sorry," Coulter said, and meant it. He recognized the particular quality of her grief, the way loss could hollow out a person while simultaneously making them stronger in the broken places. Annie looked up, meeting his eyes with steady calm. "Thank you. They were good people. My father, my mother, my younger brother Timothy. They taught me that work was a form of prayer and that the land was worth fighting for, even when it seemed determined to break you." She stood, brushing dust from her trousers. "That's why I've been moving from place to place these past 3 years, looking for land that needed tending, people who understood that farming isn't just a job, it's a calling." The afternoon work resumed with a different quality. The revelation of Annie's loss had shifted something in the group dynamic. She was no longer an outsider proving herself, but a fellow survivor who understood the weight of responsibility that came with coaxing life from soil. As the day wore on, Coulter found himself working closer to Annie, drawn by her steady competence and the way she seemed to read the wheat's needs with intuitive understanding. When her scythe blade dulled, she sharpened it with smooth, practiced strokes. When the bundles grew too heavy for easy handling, she adjusted her technique to maintain efficiency without sacrificing quality. More importantly, he noticed how she cared for the small details that separated good workers from great ones. She collected scattered grain that others left behind, ensuring nothing of value was wasted. She helped Pete when his arthritis flared, taking over his section without making him feel diminished. She shared her water freely and offered encouragement with quiet words that somehow made the brutal work feel manageable. As the sun reached its peak, something else became apparent. Storm clouds were building on the western horizon. Coulter watched them with growing concern, knowing that rain could ruin weeks of work if it caught the cut grain before it could be properly stored. "We need to pick up the pace," he announced, eyeing the darkening sky. "If that weather reaches us before we can get this section bundled and under cover, we'll lose a significant portion of the crop." The urgency added new tension to the work. This was the moment when many workers faltered, when the pressure of time and weather proved too much for their resolve. Coulter watched Annie carefully, expecting to see signs of the panic that had seized other workers in similar circumstances. Instead, Annie simply nodded and increased her pace, her movements becoming even more fluid and efficient. She began calling out instructions to coordinate their efforts, suggesting they work in a moving line formation that would allow them to clear larger sections more quickly, recommending they focus on the lowest areas first, since those would flood earliest if rain came. Her suggestions weren't presumptuous or commanding, but offered with the quiet authority of someone who had faced similar crises before. The men responded instinctively, recognizing practical wisdom when they heard it. By late afternoon, they had accomplished what Coulter had privately thought impossible. The entire eastern section was cut, bundled, and ready for loading. As the first fat raindrops began to fall, they loaded the last wagon and hauled it to the safety of the covered storage barn. Standing in the barn doorway, watching the rain begin in earnest, Coulter felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The satisfaction of a crisis met and overcome through teamwork and determination. More than that, he felt a stirring of something that might have been hope. Annie stood beside him, her hair damp with perspiration and rain, her clothes dusty and torn, her hands bleeding slightly where the work gloves had finally failed completely. She looked exhausted but triumphant, like a soldier who had won an important battle. "Thank you," Coulter said simply. Annie turned to him with a smile that transformed her tired face. "Thank you for giving me the chance to prove myself." In that moment, watching rain fall on wheat fields that were safe because of her skill and determination, Coulter Hayes realized that something fundamental had shifted in his carefully ordered world. For the first time since Sarah's death, he was looking forward to tomorrow instead of simply enduring it. The artifact of Annie's worn leather gloves lay abandoned on a workbench, finally surrendered to the day's demands. They had served their purpose, carrying her through the test that would define her place at Red Hollow Ranch. Tomorrow, she would need new gloves. But tonight, she had earned something more valuable than protection for her hands. She had earned respect, acceptance, and the beginning of something that neither she nor Coulter yet dared to name. 3 days after the storm, a new rhythm had settled over Red Hollow Ranch. Annie Rose Dillard had proven herself beyond doubt, and the men worked alongside her with the easy camaraderie that came from shared accomplishment. The morning air carried the scent of drying wheat and the promise of a successful harvest. but it was the small changes in daily routine that spoke of deeper shifts taking place. Coulter discovered the first sign on a Tuesday morning when he reached for his work shirt, the blue chambray that had been his favorite since Sarah had given it to him 6 years ago. The shirt had suffered a long tear along the right sleeve during the previous day's work, and he had resigned himself to either mending it poorly or discarding it entirely. His sewing skills, never particularly accomplished, had deteriorated further in the years since Sarah's death. But as he lifted the shirt from where he had left it, draped over a chair, he noticed immediately that the tear was gone. In its place was a line of small, precise stitches executed with thread that perfectly matched the fabric. The repair was so skillfully done that he had to look closely to see where the damage had been. The mending was clearly the work of experienced hand, someone who understood that a working man's shirt needed to be strong as well as presentable. The stitches were functional rather than decorative, designed to withstand strain while remaining nearly invisible. Most telling of all, the repair had been done with care that went beyond mere duty. Coulter held the shirt for a long moment, remembering the last time someone had mended his clothes with such attention. Sarah had possessed the same skill, the same understanding, that caring for the practical needs of daily life was its own form of tenderness. He had forgotten what it felt like to be looked after in small ways that spoke of consideration and kindness. When he emerged from the house wearing the mended shirt, Annie was already at work in the equipment yard, sharpening scythes for the day ahead. She looked up as he approached, her eyes noting the shirt, but making no comment about her handiwork. The discretion was as telling as the skill. She had performed a kindness without expectation of recognition or gratitude. "Morning, Mr. Hayes," she said, testing the edge of a blade against her thumb. "Looks to be another fine day for the harvest." "Morning, Miss Dillard," he replied, his voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Thank you for the shirt." Annie smiled a quick, pleased expression that she tried to hide by returning her attention to the scythe. "Seemed a shame to let a good shirt go to waste. You've got several more that could use attention if you don't mind me taking care of them." The offer was made casually, as if mending clothes was simply another ranch chore, like mucking stalls or repairing fence. But Coulter heard the care behind the words, the desire to contribute something beyond her already considerable labor in the fields. "I'd be grateful," he said, meaning it more than the simple words could convey. The morning's work proceeded with the efficiency that had become their standard. Annie had suggested modifications to their harvesting pattern that increased productivity while reducing the strain on Pete's aging joints. She worked with an understanding of group dynamics that kept morale high, even during the most demanding hours. But it was during the brief rest periods that Coulter found himself paying closest attention to her. Annie had a way of humming while she worked old hymns, mostly, sometimes folk songs that spoke of home and family and the eternal rhythms of farm life. The melodies seemed to make the work lighter, providing a soundtrack that transformed individual labor into something approaching harmony. "Blessed Assurance" drifted across the fields as she bundled wheat, her voice soft but clear enough to carry. Pete found himself humming along, and even the Wilson twins, not known for their musical inclinations, seemed to time their movements to her gentle rhythm. During the noon break, Annie sat apart from the men as propriety dictated, but close enough for conversation. She had brought her own lunch, simple fare of bread, cheese, and an apple butt. She contributed to the group meal by sharing preserves she had somehow acquired in town. The small gesture spoke of someone who understood that community was built through countless acts of generosity. "Where did you learn so many songs?" Matt Wilson asked, accepting a portion of the preserves with genuine appreciation. "My mother," Annie replied, her voice carrying the warmth that always accompanied memories of her family. She believed that singing made any work easier. Said it was like having company even when you were working alone. She paused, looking out over the wheat fields that stretched toward the mountains. She used to say that if you listened carefully, you could hear the land singing back to you. Different songs for different seasons, but always music if you knew how to listen. Coulter found himself studying her profile as she spoke, noting the way her face softened when she mentioned her mother. There was peace in her expression despite the grief that had shaped her recent years, a quality of acceptance that spoke of someone who had learned to carry loss without being crushed by it. "Sounds like she was a wise woman," he said. "She was." Annie agreed. "Both my parents were. They taught me that honest work was its own reward, but that didn't mean it couldn't be made more pleasant with a little music and good company." As the afternoon wore on, Coulter became increasingly aware of Annie's presence in ways that went beyond her contributions to the harvest. There was something about her steady competence and quiet grace that made the ranch feel more alive. She brought a quality of attention to everything she did, whether sharpening tools, bundling grain, or simply listening when Pete told one of his stories about the early days of the ranch. The change was subtle but unmistakable. For 5 years, Red Hollow Ranch had functioned as a place of work and memory, its rhythms dictated by necessity and the weight of the past. Annie's presence introduced something new, not a replacement for what had been lost, but an addition that made the present feel richer and more complete. When evening came and the work was finished, Coulter found himself lingering in the yard longer than usual, reluctant to retreat to the solitude of the house. Annie was washing her hands at the pump, preparing for supper, and he watched as she worked the soap into a lather with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. "Miss Dillard," he said, surprising himself with the impulse to extend their conversation, "would you care to join me on the porch after supper? I find the evening air helps settle the day's work." Annie looked up, water still dripping from her hands, her expression thoughtful. "That would be nice, Mr. Hayes, thank you." It was a small invitation, offered and accepted with the careful courtesy of two people who recognized that something was beginning between them but weren't yet ready to name it. As Coulter walked toward the house, he found himself looking forward to the evening conversation with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. The mended shirt felt comfortable against his skin, its careful repair, a reminder that kindness often revealed itself in the smallest gestures. Tomorrow there would be more wheat to cut, more challenges to meet, but tonight there would be conversation and the possibility of connection that went deeper than the shared labor that had brought them together. The artifact of the mended shirt hung in his wardrobe that night, clean and ready for another day's work. But its true significance lay not in its practical restoration, but in what it represented, the first sign that his carefully ordered world was opening to accommodate something he had thought lost forever. The gentle consideration of someone who cared enough to notice his needs and meet them without being asked. The evening conversations on Coulter's porch had become a cherished ritual over the past week. After the day's work was finished and supper cleared away, Annie would join him in the chairs that faced west toward the mountains, where the setting sun painted the sky in colors that changed with each passing moment. Their talks began with practical matters, the progress of the harvest, weather concerns, the condition of equipment, but gradually expanded to encompass deeper territories of memory and hope. On this particular evening, Coulter carried something in his hands as he settled into his customary chair. Annie noticed immediately but said nothing, having learned that he revealed his thoughts at his own pace. The object was clearly handmade, shaped from light-colored wood and smoothed to a soft finish. "I made something for you," Coulter said simply, extending his hand to show her a wooden comb carved from maple. The craftsmanship was evident in every line. The teeth were perfectly spaced and sanded smooth, the handle shaped to fit comfortably in the palm, the whole piece bearing the subtle marks of someone who understood both wood and the patience required to work it properly. Annie accepted the comb with visible surprise, turning it over in her hands to examine the careful workmanship. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice soft with genuine appreciation. "When did you find time to make this?" "Evenings, mostly," Coulter replied, pleased by her reaction but trying not to show it too obviously. "I noticed your hair working free during the day, getting in your eyes. Thought this might help keep it more manageable." The observation revealed how closely he had been watching her, noticing details that went beyond her contributions to the harvest. Annie's hair had indeed been a constant challenge during the long work, days escaping from pins and ties to catch on wheat stalks and obstruct her vision. She had been making do with a broken comb and whatever pins she could fashion from wire, but the wooden comb in her hands was a luxury she hadn't expected. "Thank you," she said, running her fingers along the smooth teeth. "It's been a long time since anyone made something just for me." She pulled the pins from her hair, letting it fall free before using the new comb to work through the tangles that had accumulated during the day's labor. The gesture was unconsciously intimate, performed with the natural grace of someone who had spent years caring for herself. Coulter watched quietly, struck by how the simple act transformed her appearance from that of a capable worker to something softer and more feminine. "You're skilled with woodworking," Annie observed, gathering her hair into a neat arrangement, secured with the comb. "Did you learn from your father?" "My grandfather, actually," Coulter replied. "He believed a man should be able to make what he needed with his own hands. Taught me to work with wood, leather, metal, whatever the ranch required. Said buying something you could make yourself was a waste of good money and an admission of laziness." He gestured toward the porch railing, which bore the subtle marks of careful maintenance and repair. "Most of what you see here was built by family hands. The house, the barn, the fences, 3 generations of Hayes men, learning from each other and improving what came before." Annie nodded, understanding the pride that came with such continuity. "My father was the same way. Said there was satisfaction in work that couldn't be bought, only earned through patience and practice." The conversation settled into comfortable silence as they watched the sun sink toward the mountains, painting the wheat fields in shades of gold and amber. This was the time of day when the ranch revealed its true beauty, when the harsh light of midday softened into something that made even the most practical landscape seem touched with magic. "Tell me about your family," Coulter said eventually, his voice gentle with the kind of invitation that came from genuine interest rather than mere politeness. "What were they like?" Annie was quiet for a moment, her fingers absently touching the wooden comb in her hair. When she spoke, her voice carried the warmth of cherished memories tempered by the ache of permanent loss. "My father was the gentlest man I ever knew," she said, "strong as an ox when it came to work, but he could calm a frightened animal with just his voice. He taught me that strength without kindness was just brutality, and that the best leaders were those who served others rather than commanding them." She smiled at something only she could see. "My mother had hands that could make anything beautiful. She could take the plainest fabric and turn it into something special, grow flowers in soil that seemed too poor to support weeds, make a simple meal taste like a feast. She taught me that caring for others was the highest calling a person could have." "And your brother?" "Timothy was 15 when the flood came," Annie said, her voice growing softer, "full of dreams about seeing the world beyond our little farm. He was going to be a teacher, maybe travel to California or Oregon. He had our father's gentleness and our mother's creativity, plus a curiosity about everything that sometimes drove our parents to distraction." She paused, looking out over the wheat fields that rustled in the evening breeze. "They were good people who deserved better than what happened to them. But they taught me enough about living and loving that I can carry their lessons with me wherever I go." Coulter heard the weight of survivor's grief in her words, the particular burden of being the one left behind to remember and honor those who were gone. It was a burden he understood intimately. "Sarah would have liked you," he said, surprising them both with the admission. It was the first time he had spoken his wife's name in Annie's presence, and the words carried significance that went beyond their simple meaning. "Tell me about her," Annie said gently, recognizing the gift he was offering by sharing his most private memories. Coulter was quiet for a long time, gathering thoughts and emotions he had kept carefully contained for 5 years. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful cadence of someone sharing sacred ground. "She was laughter," he said simply, "not the kind that came from jokes or silly things, but the kind that bubbled up from deep contentment. She could find joy in the smallest things, a perfect sunrise, a calf taking its first steps, the way bread smelled when it was baking." He gestured toward the climbing roses on the porch railing. "She planted those the first spring after we were married, said a house wasn't a home without something beautiful growing around it. Every year they bloom. I remember how she looked tending them, humming while she worked. "She sounds wonderful," Annie said, meaning it completely. "She was," Coulter agreed. "But she's been gone 5 years now, and I'm learning that grief doesn't have to mean forgetting how to live." The admission hung between them like a bridge being carefully constructed from trust and shared understanding. Neither rushed to fill the silence that followed, both recognizing that some conversations required time to settle into their proper significance. As full darkness settled over the ranch, they rose from their chairs with the reluctant movement of people who would have been content to talk longer, but recognized that tomorrow would bring another demanding day. Annie touched the wooden comb in her hair, its presence a tangible reminder of thoughtfulness and growing connection. "Thank you again for this," she said. "It's beautiful, and I'll treasure it." "Thank you for letting me make it," Coulter replied, meaning more than the simple words could convey. As Annie walked back toward the bunkhouse, Coulter remained on the porch for a few minutes longer, watching the stars emerge in the clear Montana sky. The wooden comb had been an excuse, as much as a gift, a reason to spend time working with his hands while thinking about the woman who had brought unexpected warmth back into his carefully ordered world. Tomorrow there would be more wheat to harvest, more challenges to meet together. But tonight, for the first time in years, he fell asleep thinking not about what he had lost, but about what might yet be possible in the days ahead. 2 weeks into the harvest, Coulter found himself standing at the kitchen window, watching Annie work in the morning light, a leather-bound recipe book open in his hands. The book had belonged to Sarah, filled with her careful handwriting and notes about modifications she had made to family recipes passed down through generations. For 5 years, it had remained closed on a shelf, too painful to open, but too precious to discard. Now, as he traced his finger along Sarah's familiar script, Coulter realized the book no longer brought only pain. Instead, it seemed to offer a bridge between the love he had known and the possibility of something new, beginning to take root in his heart. The decision to share the recipes with Annie had come gradually, born from observing how she approached every task with the same careful attention Sarah had brought to cooking. When Martha, the woman who came from town to prepare meals during harvest season, had fallen ill with a fever, Annie had quietly stepped in to handle the cooking duties without being asked. Her meals were simple but satisfying, prepared with an understanding of what working people needed to sustain themselves through long days of physical labor. But Coulter had noticed her looking wistfully at the kitchen garden Sarah had planted, where herbs and vegetables still grew with stubborn persistence despite his neglect. He had seen her examining the cast-iron pots and skillets with the appreciative eye of someone who understood good cookware, and he had made his decision. "Miss Dillard," he called through the kitchen door, "might I have a word with you?" Annie finished organizing the tools she had been cleaning and joined him in the kitchen, her hands still damp from washing. She moved with the comfortable familiarity of someone who felt at home in domestic spaces, but her expression showed curiosity about the unusual summons. "I wanted to show you something," Coulter said, holding out the recipe book. "These were my wife's recipes. I thought you might find them useful while Martha is recovering." Annie accepted the book with obvious reverence, understanding immediately that she was being trusted with something precious. She opened it carefully, revealing pages filled with neat handwriting, pressed flowers used as bookmarks, and notes that spoke of a woman who had found joy in feeding others well. "Molasses cookies for winter evenings," she read aloud from one page. "Beef stew that will warm a man's bones after a day in the cold." She looked up at Coulter with eyes that showed deep appreciation for the gift he was offering. She must have been a wonderful cook. "She was," Coulter replied, finding that speaking of Sarah's talents brought warmth rather than pain. But more than that, she understood that feeding people was a way of caring for them. Every meal was prepared with love, and you could taste the difference. Annie turned pages slowly, pausing to read the handwritten notes that accompanied each recipe. Sarah's personality emerged through her additions comments about which herbs grew best in Montana soil, adjustments for high-altitude baking, suggestions for making simple ingredients into something special. "Look at this," Annie said, pointing to a recipe for cornbread that included a note in the margin. Add honey when the men have worked especially hard. It lifts spirits as much as it sweetens the bread. Coulter smiled at the memory. She was always thinking about what people needed, not just what they wanted. During difficult times, she could make a meal from almost nothing that somehow felt like a feast. "These recipes are treasures," Annie said, closing the book gently. "Are you certain you want to share them? I know how precious they must be to you." "I'm certain," Coulter replied, meaning it completely. Sarah would have wanted them to be used, not gathering dust on a shelf. She believed recipes were meant to bring people together, not serve as monuments to the past. The trust implicit in his gesture was not lost on Annie. She had been on the ranch long enough to understand that Coulter shared his private memories carefully, and the fact that he was willing to entrust her with something so intimately connected to his late wife spoke of a growing bond between them. That evening, Annie prepared supper, using one of Sarah's recipes, a hearty vegetable soup enhanced with herbs from the neglected garden, and served with fresh bread that filled the kitchen with warmth and the scent of home. The meal was simple, but somehow transformed by the connection to the woman who had first perfected the recipe. Pete and the Wilson twins remarked on the exceptional quality of the food, but Coulter ate in thoughtful silence, tasting not just the soup, but the memory of similar meals shared with Sarah around this same table. Instead of sadness, however, he felt a sense of continuity, as if Sarah's gift for nurturing others was finding new expression through Annie's capable hands. After supper, as had become their custom, Annie and Coulter sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. But tonight, their conversation carried a deeper intimacy, born from the shared experience of honoring Sarah's memory together. "She had beautiful handwriting," Annie observed, the recipe book open in her lap. "You can see her personality in every word. Careful but not fussy, elegant but practical." "She was like that in everything she did," Coulter replied. "Never wasted effort on show, but somehow made even the simplest things beautiful just by the attention she gave them." Annie nodded, understanding the rare quality he was describing. "My mother was similar. She used to say that love was in the details, the extra minute spent making something right, the small touches that showed you cared about the people you were serving." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in memories of the women who had shaped their understanding of what it meant to create a home. The evening air carried the scent of ripening wheat and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night, creating a sense of peace that seemed to embrace them both. "I hope I can do justice to her recipes," Annie said eventually. "They clearly came from someone who understood that cooking was about more than just nutrition." "You already have," Coulter assured her. "Tonight's soup tasted exactly as Sarah would have made it, not because you followed her recipe perfectly, but because you brought the same spirit of caring to the preparation." The observation touched something deep in Annie's heart. For 3 years, she had wandered from place to place, offering her skills wherever they were needed, but never finding anywhere that felt like home. Here at Red Hollow Ranch, working alongside people who appreciated her contributions and trusted her with their most precious memories, she was beginning to feel something she had thought lost forever, a sense of belonging. "Thank you for sharing this with me," she said, her voice soft with emotion. "It means more than you might realize." "Thank you for being someone worthy of sharing it with," Coulter replied, his words carrying weight that went far beyond the simple exchange. As the stars emerged in the clear Montana sky, they remained on the porch longer than usual, neither willing to break the spell of intimacy that had settled over them. The recipe book lay between them like a bridge connecting past and present, honoring what had been while opening the door to what might yet come to be. When they finally rose to retire for the night, Annie carried the book with careful reverence, understanding that she had been entrusted with something far more valuable than cooking instructions. She had been given a glimpse into the heart of the family that had built Red Hollow Ranch, and with it, an invitation to become part of the story that was still being written. In his bedroom, Coulter lay awake thinking about the evening's conversation and the way Annie's face had glowed in the lamplight as she read Sarah's recipes. For the first time since his wife's death, sharing memories of Sarah had brought joy rather than pain. and he found himself looking forward to seeing how Annie would interpret and build upon the culinary legacy that had been such an important part of making Red Hollow Ranch a true home. The storm clouds had been building for 3 days, dark and threatening on the western horizon, turning the evening skies an ominous shade of purple that made everyone at Red Hollow Ranch nervous. With half the wheat still standing in the fields, the timing couldn't have been worse. But it was during the quiet evening hours, when the oppressive humidity made work impossible and conversation the only refuge from worry, that Annie finally shared the photograph she carried in her shirt pocket. She had taken it out almost without thinking, her fingers seeking the familiar comfort of the small tin type during a particularly anxious moment as they watched lightning flicker in the distant clouds. Coulter noticed the gesture and the way her expression softened as she looked at the image, but he said nothing until she seemed ready to share. "My family," Annie said simply, holding the photograph so he could see it. The image was slightly faded, but clear enough to reveal 4 figures posed in front of a modest farmhouse. A tall man with kind eyes and work, roughened hands, a woman whose smile radiated warmth even through the formal constraints of portrait photography, and 2 younger people who shared unmistakable family resemblances with Annie herself. "This was taken the spring before the flood," Annie continued, her voice carrying the careful control of someone who had learned to speak of loss without being overwhelmed by it. "We had just finished planting, and my mother insisted we needed a family portrait, said she had a feeling it was important to capture that moment." Coulter studied the photograph with respectful attention, seeing in the faces the source of Annie's strength and gentleness. Her father's stance showed the quiet confidence of a man comfortable with hard work and responsibility. Her mother's expression radiated the kind of warmth that made strangers feel welcome and family feel cherished. Timothy, barely more than a boy but trying to look adult for the camera, displayed the eager intelligence Annie had described. "They looked like good people," Coulter said, meaning it completely. "They were," Annie replied, carefully returning the photograph to her pocket. "My father used to say that a family was like a crop, it needed tending, patience, and faith that good things would grow if you provided the right conditions." Thunder rumbled in the distance, closer now than it had been an hour earlier. Both of them looked toward the western sky, where the storm clouds had taken on an even more threatening aspect. The air was so still it seemed to press against them, heavy with moisture and the electric tension that preceded violent weather. "We'll lose a significant portion of the harvest if that storm hits before we can get the remaining wheat cut and stored," Coulter said, voicing the worry that had been growing in both their minds. "How much can we realistically accomplish if we start at first light?" Annie asked, her practical nature immediately turning to problem-solving rather than helpless anxiety. Coulter considered the question seriously. "With the crew we have, working at maximum efficiency, we might get 2/3 of it in. But that assumes the weather holds for at least 12 hours, and these clouds suggest we might not have that long." Annie was quiet for a moment, her mind clearly working through possibilities. When she spoke, her voice carried the conviction of someone who had faced crisis before and learned that solutions often required thinking beyond conventional approaches. "What if we brought in help from neighboring ranches? Surely other farmers understand that we all face the same weather, and what threatens one of us threatens all of us." The suggestion was logical but challenging. Ranch culture valued independence and self-reliance, and asking for help was often seen as an admission of weakness or poor planning. But Annie's perspective, shaped by the cooperative traditions of agricultural communities, recognized that survival sometimes required setting aside pride in favor of practical cooperation. "The Hendersons might be willing," Coulter said thoughtfully. "Their harvest is already in, and Tom Henderson has never forgotten the help my father gave him during the drought of '87. The Martinez family might send a few hands too, if we asked." "Then we should ask," Annie said simply. "Tomorrow, if the weather holds, I'll ride out to speak with them myself. Sometimes these conversations go better when they're woman to woman, mother to mother." The offer surprised Coulter. In his experience, Most temporary workers focused narrowly on their own responsibilities, avoiding anything that might complicate their position or extend their obligations. But Annie consistently demonstrated that her investment in Red Hollow Ranch went far beyond the terms of her employment. "You'd do that?" he asked. "Of course," Annie replied, as if the question itself was unnecessary. "This place has become home to me, Mr. Hayes. I'm not about to watch it suffer for lack of effort on my part." The simple declaration carried profound significance. For Annie, who had been wandering for 3 years without finding anywhere that felt like more than temporary shelter, the admission that Red Hollow Ranch had become home represented a fundamental shift in how she saw her future. For Coulter, hearing her describe his family's land as home touched something deep in his heart that had been dormant since Sarah's death. The ranch had been a place of work and memory for so long that he had almost forgotten it could also be a place where new roots might grow and new happiness might flourish. As if summoned by their conversation about cooperation, Pete Garrison appeared on the porch, his weathered face grave with concern. "Hate to interrupt," he said, "but we've got visitors coming up the road, 3 riders, moving fast like they've got urgent business." In the growing darkness, lit by occasional flashes of lightning, they could see the approaching horsemen. As they drew closer, Coulter recognized the lead rider Tom Henderson from the neighboring ranch, accompanied by 2 of his sons. "Coulter," Tom called as he rode into the yard. "We saw the storm building and figured you might need extra hands to get your crop in before the weather breaks. We've got 8 men ready to work if you can use them." The generous offer, coming without being solicited, demonstrated the kind of community spirit that had built the Montana Territory. Tom Henderson was a practical man who understood that helping neighbors was both the right thing to do and good insurance against the day when he might need similar assistance. "Tom, I can't tell you how much I appreciate this," Coulter said, genuine gratitude evident in his voice. "We'll take all the help we can get." "What's the plan?" Tom asked, dismounting and approaching the porch. "My boys and I can work through the night if necessary." Annie stepped forward, her voice carrying quiet authority as she outlined the strategy she had been developing. "If we divide into 3 teams, we can work different sections simultaneously. The key is coordination. We need to cut, bundle, and load in sequence so nothing gets left in the field if the rain starts." Tom nodded approvingly. "Sounds like you know what you're about, miss. We'll follow your lead." As the men dispersed to prepare for an early start, Annie and Coulter remained on the porch, watching lightning play across the darkening sky. The photograph in her pocket seemed to carry extra weight, now a reminder of family lost, but also of the new connections being forged through shared struggle and mutual care. "Thank you," Coulter said quietly, "for everything you've done to help save this harvest." "Thank you for giving me something worth saving," Annie replied, her words carrying layers of meaning that went far beyond agriculture. The storm was coming, but they would meet it together, with the strength that came from community and the hope that grew from working toward a common goal. In her pocket, the family photograph served as both memory and promisor, reminder of love that had been, and a symbol of love that might yet bloom in the fertile soil of Red Hollow Ranch. The morning after the storm had passed, leaving the wheat fields miraculously intact, thanks to the heroic efforts of the combined crews, Annie discovered the railroad survey stakes while checking the eastern boundary fence for storm damage. The wooden stakes, each bearing the distinctive marking of the Montana Territory Railroad Commission, had been driven into the ground at precise intervals along the property line, creating a geometric pattern that spoke of official authority and imminent change. At first, Annie assumed the stakes were part of some routine government survey, perhaps related to property taxes or territorial mapping. But as she walked the fence line, counting more than 24 stakes extending along the entire eastern border of Red Hollow Ranch, a growing sense of unease settled in her stomach. This was no casual survey. This was the methodical marking of land designated for acquisition. When she returned to the ranch house, she found Coulter in his study, bent over a collection of papers spread across his desk. The morning light, streaming through the window, illuminated documents that she could see were official in nature, bearing letterheads and seals that suggested correspondence with territorial authorities. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone trying not to make assumptions. "I found survey stakes along the eastern property line. Quite a few of them, marked with railroad commission symbols." Coulter's reaction was immediate and telling. His shoulders tensed, and he gathered the papers on his desk into a neat stack with movements that suggested he was buying time to formulate a response. When he looked up, his expression carried the weight of someone who had been carrying a burden alone for too long. "I should have mentioned the railroad interest earlier," he said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "The Territorial Commission has been in contact about the possibility of running a spur line through this area to connect the mining operations in the mountains with the main rail network." Annie felt her heart sink as the implications became clear. "They want to buy Red Hollow Ranch." "Part of it," Coulter replied, though his tone suggested the distinction was not as meaningful as he wished it could be. "The eastern section, which includes some of our best wheat land, and the water rights to Miller's Creek." The significance hit Annie like a physical blow. Miller's Creek provided irrigation for nearly half the ranch's agricultural land. Without it, Red Hollow Ranch would be reduced to a marginal operation that could barely support one family, let alone employ additional workers or generate the income necessary to maintain the property. "What have you told them?" Annie asked, though she suspected from his demeanor that the answer would not be what she hoped to hear. Coulter was quiet for a long moment, his fingers unconsciously turning the wedding ring on his left-hander gesture Annie had come to recognize as a sign that he was wrestling with difficult emotions. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of a man who had been considering options that went against everything he thought he believed about his own future. "I haven't given them a final answer," he said carefully, "but I haven't refused their offer either." The admission hung between them like a chasm that had suddenly opened in ground Annie had thought was solid. For weeks, she had been investing herself emotionally in Red Hollow Ranch, seeing it not just as temporary employment, but as a potential home where she might finally stop wandering and start building a new life. The revelation that Coulter was seriously considering selling the heart of the ranch felt like a betrayal of everything they had been working toward together. "How long have you been considering this?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled despite the turmoil she felt inside. "Since before you arrived," Coulter replied honestly. "The offer first came 6 months ago, and it's been weighing on my mind ever since." Annie walked to the window, looking out over the wheat fields where they had worked side by side, where she had proven herself worthy of respect and where she had begun to imagine a future that now seemed to be crumbling beneath her feet. The survey stakes were visible from this vantage point, geometric intrusions on a landscape that had seemed eternal and secure. "What's the offer?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. Coulter opened the top drawer of his desk and withdrew a formal document bearing official seals and signatures. "Enough to pay off the ranch's debts completely, with sufficient left over to purchase a smaller property elsewhere, maybe, in Oregon or California, where the climate is milder and the living might be easier." The practical wisdom of the offer was undeniable. Red Hollow Ranch carried financial burdens that made every season a struggle, and Montana winters were harsh enough to age a man prematurely. The railroad's offer represented security, freedom from debt, and the possibility of starting over in a place where success might come more easily. But Annie heard something else in Coulter's explanation, a weariness that spoke of a man who had been carrying the weight of responsibility alone for too long. Since Sarah's death, he had been the sole guardian of his family's legacy, making every decision without the support and counsel that had once come from shared partnership. The burden had worn him down in ways that went beyond mere physical exhaustion. "Is this what you want?" Annie asked, turning from the window to face him directly. "To sell the land your family built and start over somewhere else?" "I don't know what I want anymore," Coulter replied with painful honesty. "For 5 years, I've been maintaining this place out of duty and memory, but I'm not sure that's enough anymore. Maybe it's time to let go of the past and try to build something new." The words cut Annie more deeply than she had expected. She had begun to see herself as part of what was being built at Red Hollow Ranch, not a replacement for what Coulter had lost, but an addition that might help create something different, but equally valuable. The possibility that he viewed the ranch as a burden to be shed, rather than a foundation to be built upon, challenged everything she had hoped might develop between them. "What about the people who depend on this place?" she asked, thinking of Pete Garrison, who had worked for the Hayes family for decades, and the Wilson twins, whose families lived in houses on ranch property. "What about the community that's grown up around Red Hollow Ranch?" "The railroad has offered employment to anyone who wants it," Coulter replied, though his tone suggested he understood the inadequacy of that solution. "Pete could come with me to wherever I relocate, if he's willing. The Wilsons could stay and work for the railroad, or they could find positions with other ranchers in the area." Annie recognized the rationalization in his words, the way people talked themselves into difficult decisions by focusing on practical arrangements while ignoring the emotional and spiritual costs. She had done the same thing herself after the flood, convincing herself that wandering from place to place was freedom rather than rootlessness, opportunity rather than loss. "When do they need your answer?" she asked. 2 weeks, Coulter replied. "They want to begin construction before winter, which means the sale would need to be finalized by the end of this month." The timeline added urgency to what had already become a crisis of both practical and emotional dimensions. In 2 weeks, everything Annie had come to hope for could be swept away as thoroughly as her family's farm had been destroyed by floodwaters 3 years earlier. But as she stood in Coulter's study, surrounded by the accumulated documents of a family's 3-generation investment in Montana soil, Annie realized that this crisis was different from the natural disaster that had claimed her previous life. The flood had been beyond human control, an act of nature that no amount of planning or effort could have prevented. This threat was man-made, which meant it could be fought with human determination and creativity. "Have you considered that there might be alternatives to selling?" she asked, her voice carrying the quiet conviction that had sustained her through 3 years of wandering and uncertainty. Coulter looked up with surprise, as if the possibility of fighting the railroad's offer had not occurred to him. "What kind of alternatives?" "I don't know yet," Annie replied honestly, "but I know that giving up without exploring every option isn't the answer. Your family didn't build this place over 3 generations just to surrender it to the first outside pressure that came along." The words hung in the air between them, carrying both challenge and promise. For the first time since discovering the survey stakes, Annie felt something other than despair, a spark of the determination that had carried her through flood and loss and the long years of searching for a place where she belonged. The railroad survey stakes represented a threat to everything she had come to value, but they also represented an opportunity to fight for something worth having. If Red Hollow Ranch was truly going to become her home, then she was prepared to defend it with the same fierce loyalty she had once given to the Nebraska farm, where she had learned that some things were worth any sacrifice to preserve. The artifact of the survey stakes stood like geometric soldiers along the eastern boundary, markers of an invasion that threatened to destroy not just a ranch, but the dreams and hopes of everyone who had found meaning in its continuing existence. But wars had been won against greater odds, and Annie Rose Dillard had not survived flood and loss and 3 years of wandering just to surrender without a fight when she finally found something worth defending. The final week of harvest took on desperate urgency after Annie's discovery of the railroad survey stakes. Every cut stalk of wheat, every bundle loaded onto wagons, every grain stored safely in the barn became an act of defiance against the forces that threatened to tear Red Hollow Ranch apart. But it was Annie's methodical campaign to save the ranch that truly transformed the atmosphere from resignation to determined resistance. She began by examining every document in Coulter's study, spreading papers across the kitchen table like a general planning a military campaign. Legal correspondence, financial records, property deeds, and territorial maps covered every available surface as she worked to understand exactly what they were fighting and what weapons they had available for the battle. The railroad's offer assumes they can acquire the water rights to Miller's Creek along with the eastern section of land. Annie explained to Coulter and Pete during a strategy session that lasted well past midnight. But according to your grandfather's original filing, those water rights are tied to the entire ranch property, not just the eastern section. They can't legally separate them. Pete leaned forward, his weathered face showing the first spark of hope he had displayed since learning about the railroad threat. Are you saying they can't force us to sell the water rights? I'm saying their legal position isn't as strong as they want us to believe, Annie replied, her finger tracing lines on a territorial map that showed the creek's path through multiple properties. Miller's Creek originates in the mountains and flows through 3 different ranches before joining the main river. Your grandfather was careful to secure rights to the entire flow, not just the portion that crosses Red Hollow land. Coulter studied the documents with new attention, seeing his family's legacy through Annie's analytical perspective. What does that mean for their railroad plans? It means they need our cooperation, Annie said with quiet satisfaction. Without water rights, their proposed route becomes significantly more expensive because they'll have to engineer around the creek instead of using it for their operations. The revelation changed the entire dynamic of their situation. Instead of being victims of inevitable progress, they suddenly found themselves holding a crucial piece of the puzzle that the railroad needed to complete their plans. The survey stakes that had seemed like harbingers of doom began to look more like premature declarations of victory. But Annie's research had revealed other troubling information. The railroad's interest in the area was part of a larger development scheme that would transform the entire valley from agricultural land into industrial infrastructure. If Red Hollow Ranch fell, other family operations would likely follow, creating a cascade of change that would destroy the rural community that had taken decades to establish. We're not just fighting for this ranch, Annie told the assembled group that included the Wilson twins, Pete, and several neighbors who had come to help with the final push of harvest. We're fighting for a way of life that once lost can never be recovered. The words carried special weight, coming from someone who had already lost everything once to forces beyond her control. Annie's personal history gave her a moral authority that transformed their struggle from a property dispute into something approaching a crusade. Working by lamplight after each day's harvest labor, Annie composed letters to territorial officials, researched precedents for challenging railroad acquisitions, and coordinated with neighboring ranchers who were beginning to understand that their own properties might be at risk if Red Hollow Ranch was forced to sell. The physical artifact of her campaign was an old hand-forged scythe that had belonged to Coulter's grandfather, a tool that represented 3 generations of Hayes' family commitment to working the land with their own hands. Annie had discovered it in the barn, carefully preserved but unused since newer equipment had replaced it years earlier. She brought it to the kitchen table where she worked on legal documents, its presence serving as a reminder of what they were fighting to preserve. This scythe cut the first wheat planted on Red Hollow land, Coulter told her, running his fingers along the worn wooden handle. My grandfather made it himself from iron he brought from Pennsylvania. He used to say that a man who couldn't make his own tools had no business calling himself a farmer. The scythe became a symbol of their resistance just to the railroad's immediate threat, but to the larger forces of industrialization that sought to transform small family operations into corporate enterprises. It represented the human scale of agriculture, where individual skill and dedication could still make a meaningful difference. As word spread about Red Hollow Ranch's legal challenges to the railroad acquisition, other ranchers began to take notice. Tom Henderson arrived one evening with news that the Martinez family was facing similar pressure to sell their land for railroad development. The Campbell Ranch to the north had received an official inquiry about their willingness to negotiate. They're trying to put together a package deal, Tom explained, his face grim with understanding. Take out several operations at once to create a clear corridor for their line. The revelation transformed Annie's individual research project into a coordinated community response. Ranchers who had viewed each other as competitors began sharing information and resources, recognizing that their individual survival depended on collective resistance. Annie found herself at the center of this growing alliance, her combination of analytical skills and personal commitment making her a natural leader for the cause. She organized meetings, coordinated legal research, and maintained correspondence with territorial officials who were beginning to pay attention to the organized opposition developing in their district. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. While researching territorial law in the small collection of legal texts available in town, Annie discovered a provision that could completely change their strategic position. The territorial government had established protections for agricultural operations that provided food security for local communities, and these protections could potentially override railroad acquisition authority. If we can demonstrate that Red Hollow Ranch and the other threatened properties are essential for regional food production, Annie explained to a gathering of ranchers in the Hayes kitchen. The territorial government has the authority to deny the railroad's acquisition requests. The legal technicality was complex, but the basic principle was simple. Communities had the right to protect their food sources from disruption by outside commercial interests. Red Hollow Ranch and the other threatened properties could claim protection under this provision if they could prove their importance to regional food security. "How do we prove something like that?" asked Martinez, his English careful, but his understanding sharp. "Documentation," Annie replied, spreading ledgers and records across the table. "We need to show exactly how much food each ranch produces, where it goes, who depends on it. We need to create a picture of agricultural operations so integrated into the community's survival that removing them would constitute a threat to public welfare." The work was tedious but crucial. Every sale record, every delivery to local merchants, every contribution to community events had to be documented and compiled into a comprehensive argument for protection. The ranchers worked together with an intensity born from the understanding that failure would mean the end of everything they had built. Coulter watched Annie coordinate this effort with amazement and growing admiration. The woman who had arrived at his ranch asking for simple harvest work had transformed into a strategist whose vision and determination were inspiring an entire community to fight for their survival. But beyond her obvious capabilities, Coulter found himself moved by Annie's personal investment in the struggle. She could have walked away at any time, found work elsewhere, avoided the complications and uncertainties that came with opposing powerful commercial interests. Instead, she had chosen to stay and fight for a place that had become precious to her. The hand-forged scythe remained on the kitchen table throughout these evening strategy sessions, its presence a constant reminder of the generations of work and dedication that had created what they were now fighting to preserve. Sometimes Annie would rest her hand on its worn handle while she explained legal concepts or coordinated research assignments, drawing strength from its connection to the past and its promise for the future. As the deadline for Coulter's response to the railroad approached, the kitchen table became command headquarters for a resistance movement that had grown far beyond anything Annie had originally envisioned. Maps, legal documents, correspondence, and ledgers covered every surface, creating a paper fortress around the old scythe that had become their unlikely symbol of defiance. "Whatever happens," Annie told Coulter during a quiet moment between strategy sessions, "we'll know we fought for something worth having." Coulter looked at her across the cluttered table, seeing not just the capable woman who had saved his harvest, but the partner he had never thought to hope for again. The railroad survey stakes might represent a threat to his land, but Annie's presence represented something far more precious: the possibility that Red Hollow Ranch could become not just a preserved memorial to the past, but a living foundation for a future neither of them had dared to imagine alone. The old scythe gleamed in the lamplight, its blade sharp enough to cut wheat, its symbolism sharp enough to cut through the fear and uncertainty that had dominated their lives for too long. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation with forces that sought to destroy what 3 generations had built. But tonight, surrounded by the tools and documents of their resistance, they felt the quiet confidence that came from knowing they had done everything possible to preserve what mattered most. The second storm came without warning, on the morning when everything would be decided. Annie woke to the sound of wind howling around the bunkhouse and rain hammering against the windows with a fury that made the previous week's weather seem gentle by comparison. But this was the day the railroad officials were returning for Coulter's final answer, and no amount of natural violence could postpone the confrontation that would determine the future of Red Hollow Ranch. The storm-battered tarp that covered the remaining wheat bundles had torn loose during the night, flapping wildly in the wind like a flag of surrender. Annie could see it from her window as she dressed hurriedly, understanding immediately that their carefully preserved harvest was in mortal danger. Weeks of back-breaking labor, the successful coordination of multiple ranch crews, and their hope of proving the ranch's agricultural importance, all of it, could be destroyed in a matter of hours if they couldn't protect the grain from the driving rain. She ran through the storm to the main house, her clothes soaked through before she had covered half the distance. Coulter was already awake, standing at the kitchen window, watching the tarp whip back and forth with an expression that mixed desperation with grim determination. "How much can we save?" Annie shouted over the sound of the storm as she burst through the kitchen door, water streaming from her hair and clothes. "Not enough," Coulter replied, his voice heavy with the weight of impending loss. "That tarp was all that stood between our grain and ruin. Without it, we'll lose everything we couldn't get under permanent cover." Annie wiped rain from her face and studied the situation through the window. The damaged tarp was large enough to protect the remaining wheat if they could secure it properly, but the wind was so strong that any attempt to handle the heavy canvas would be extremely dangerous. One person caught by a wind gust while trying to control the tarp could be seriously injured or killed. "We need everyone," she said, her mind already calculating the logistics of what would have to be done. "Pete, the Wilson twins, anyone else we can gather. If we work together, we can wrestle that tarp back into position." "In this wind?" Coulter asked, concern evident in his voice. "Annie, it's too dangerous. I won't risk anyone's life for wheat, no matter how important it is to our legal case." But Annie was already moving toward the door, her determination overriding caution. "That wheat represents more than our legal case," she called back to him. "It represents everything we've worked for, everything we've promised to preserve." She disappeared back into the storm, and Coulter watched through the window as she fought her way to the bunkhouse to rouse Pete and the Wilson twins. Within minutes, all four figures emerged into the howling wind, moving with the coordinated purpose of people who had worked together long enough to communicate without words. The scene that unfolded in the barnyard was like something from an ancient epic, 5 people battling the elements to save the fruit of their labor from destruction. The tarp, heavy with accumulated rainwater and whipped by wind gusts that threatened to lift it into the air, fought them like a living thing that resented being controlled. Annie positioned herself at one corner of the tarp, her small frame nearly lifted off the ground by the wind's force. Pete and the Wilson twins took positions along the sides, while Coulter grabbed the remaining corner, all of them working together to guide the massive canvas back over the exposed wheat bundles. The physical demands were enormous, but the emotional stakes made their effort heroic. Every grain they saved was a victory against the forces that sought to destroy their way of life. Every successful coordination of movement brought them closer to preserving not just their harvest, but their hope. Twice the wind tore the tarp from their hands, sending it billowing across the yard like a giant sail. Each time, they chased it down and began again, their clothes soaked through, their hands cut by the rough canvas, their bodies pushed beyond the limits of normal endurance. But gradually, through persistence and teamwork, they managed to work the tarp back into position over the wheat bundles. The final challenge was securing it against the continuing storm, a task that required driving stakes through the canvas into the ground, while the wind tried to tear everything loose again. Annie found herself working beside Coulter, both of them hammering stakes with desperate efficiency, while Pete and the twins held the tarp in position. Rain streamed down their faces, making it difficult to see, but their movements had acquired the rhythm of people who had learned to work as one. When the last stake was driven home and the tarp finally lay secure over their precious grain, they stood in the storm looking at what they had accomplished with the satisfaction of soldiers who had won an important battle. The wheat was safe, their legal case was preserved, and they had proven once again that determination and cooperation could overcome seemingly impossible odds. But even as they caught their breath and began to assess the success of their emergency efforts, Annie noticed something that made her heart sink. In the distance, barely visible through the driving rain, 3 riders were approaching Red Hollow Ranch. The railroad officials had arrived exactly on schedule, and the storm that had nearly destroyed their harvest would now serve as the dramatic backdrop for the confrontation that would determine everything. The railroad officials arrived like harbingers of a different world, 3 men in city clothes riding horses that clearly belonged to a livery stable rather than working ranch stock. They wore long coats that shed water efficiently and boots that had never known honest mud, their appearance as foreign to Red Hollow Ranch as their intentions were to its continued existence. The lead official, a thin man with carefully waxed mustache and papers tucked inside an oiled leather satchel, introduced himself as Herbert Blackwood, representing the Montana Territory Railroad Commission. His companions remained mounted, their expressions suggesting they viewed the storm-soaked ranch hands with a mixture of professional indifference and barely concealed disdain. "Mr. Hayes," Blackwood called from horseback, raising his voice to be heard over the continuing storm. "I trust you've had sufficient time to consider our generous offer. The Commission is prepared to finalize the transaction today, if you're ready to proceed." Coulter stepped forward, water still streaming from his hair and work clothes, but his bearing carried the quiet dignity of a man defending his ancestral home. Behind him, Annie stood with Pete and the Wilson twins, all of them united by their shared struggle against the storm and their common determination to preserve what they had built together. "Mr. Blackwood," Coulter replied, his voice steady despite the wind, "I appreciate the Commission's interest in Red Hollow Ranch, but I'm afraid your offer is based on some incorrect assumptions about what's available for sale." The railroad official's expression tightened with the irritation of someone who had expected a simple business transaction and was now facing unexpected complications. "Mr. Hayes, we've been through this before. The Commission has the authority to acquire private property for essential territorial development. Your cooperation would be appreciated, but it's not strictly necessary." It was Annie who stepped forward, carrying the leather satchel that contained the results of weeks of legal research and documentation. Her small frame seemed dwarfed by the storm and the magnitude of the forces arrayed against them, but her voice carried absolute conviction as she addressed the officials. "Actually, Mr. Blackwood, it is necessary," she said, opening the satchel to reveal the carefully organized papers within. "Red Hollow Ranch and several neighboring properties have applied for protection under Territorial Statute 247C, which preserves agricultural operations essential to regional food security." Blackwood's expression shifted from irritation to genuine surprise. Clearly, he had not expected to encounter organized legal resistance from what he had assumed would be simple farming folk intimidated by official authority. "I'm not familiar with that statute," he said, though his tone suggested he was beginning to take their opposition more seriously. Annie withdrew a carefully copied document from the satchel, holding it so the official could see the territorial seal and official signatures despite the driving rain. It was enacted in 1889, specifically to prevent disruption of agricultural operations that serve community needs. Red Hollow Ranch and its neighbors provide grain and beef to 6 different towns in this region. She gestured toward the wheat field, where the golden sheaf of successfully harvested grain lay protected under the storm-battered tarp. This year's harvest alone represents enough grain to feed 300 families through the winter. The territorial government cannot legally permit the disruption of such operations without demonstrating that alternative food sources are available. The railroad official dismounted, clearly recognizing that this conversation required more attention than could be given from horseback. He approached Annie and extended his hand for the documents, studying them with the careful attention of someone who understood the difference between amateur legal research and professionally prepared challenges. "These appear to be properly filed," he admitted grudgingly, "but the Railroad Commission has its own legal authority that supersedes local protections." "Not in this case," Annie replied firmly. "Federal territorial law specifically grants priority to food security provisions over commercial development interests. Your railroad can be built, Mr. Blackwood, but it will have to find a route that doesn't disrupt established agricultural operations." Coulter watched the exchange with growing amazement and pride. The woman who had arrived at his ranch asking for simple harvest work was now facing down territorial officials with the confidence of someone who had thoroughly mastered the legal complexities of their situation. "Furthermore," Annie continued, pulling additional documents from the satchel, "the water rights to Miller's Creek cannot be separated from the ranch properties without violating the original territorial grants that established them. Your proposed route would require water access that simply isn't legally available." Blackwood studied the documents with increasing frustration, clearly recognizing that his commission's plans had been based on incomplete legal research. The assumption that rural ranchers would be unable to mount sophisticated resistance was proving costly. "The commission will need to review these filings," he said finally, his tone suggesting defeat rather than mere delay. "This may require alternative arrangements." "Alternative arrangements are certainly possible," Annie replied, her voice taking on the diplomatic tone of someone who understood that victory required offering the defeated party a way to save face. "The ranchers in this area are willing to discuss right-of-way agreements that would allow railroad access without requiring property acquisition." The suggestion transformed the entire dynamic of the conversation. Instead of the railroad attempting to acquire ranch property by force, they were now being offered the possibility of achieving their goals through cooperative agreement that preserved both commercial development and agricultural operations. "What kind of arrangements?" Blackwood asked, his professional interest overriding his personal frustration. Annie looked to Coulter, recognizing that such negotiations needed to come from the property owners themselves, rather than from her advocacy role. Coulter stepped forward, understanding his cue. "Easement agreements," he said. "The railroad could have the access it needs without destroying the agricultural operations that depend on this land. We keep our farms, you get your rail line, and the community benefits from both." The compromise offered something for everyone, while preserving what mattered most to the ranchers. Blackwood nodded slowly, clearly recognizing that this solution would be easier to sell to his superiors than explaining how their carefully planned acquisition had been derailed by unexpected legal challenges. "I'll need to discuss this with the commission," he said, carefully returning the documents to Annie. "But this alternative approach may indeed be worth pursuing." As the railroad officials rode away through the continuing storm, Annie and Coulter stood watching until they disappeared into the grey distance. The golden sheaf of wheat, protected under its storm-battered tarp, had become the symbol of their victory, not just the preservation of their harvest, but the preservation of their way of life. "We did it," Coulter said quietly, his voice filled with amazement at what they had accomplished together. "We did," Annie agreed, her hand finding his as they stood together in the rain, united by their shared triumph and the future they had fought to preserve. 6 months after the storm that had nearly destroyed their harvest and instead delivered their salvation, Red Hollow Ranch glowed in the soft light of an autumn morning that promised to be perfect for a wedding. The wheat fields, now showing the fresh green of winter plantings, stretched toward mountains that wore their first dusting of snow like nature's blessing on the day's celebration. Annie Rose Dillard stood before the mirror in what had once been Sarah's room, adjusting the simple white dress she had sewn during the long winter evenings. The fabric was good quality cotton, purchased with her share of the harvest profits, and the cut was practical enough to serve for both wedding day and the working life that would follow. Her hair was arranged with the wooden comb Coulter had carved for her, its maple finish now mellowed by months of use into something that seemed part of her natural beauty. The room around her bore traces of both women who had called it home. Sarah's quilt still covered the bed, but Annie's sewing basket sat beside the window where the morning light fell perfect for close work. The wedding ring that Coulter had worn for 5 years as a memorial to the past lay on the dresser beside a new ring simple gold that would mark the beginning of their shared future. Through the window, Annie could see the preparations taking place in the yard below. Pete Garrison, wearing his best shirt and a tie that clearly made him uncomfortable, was arranging chairs borrowed from the church in town. The Wilson twins were setting up tables for the wedding feast, their wives bustling between the kitchen and the yard with covered dishes that would feed the entire community. The celebration was to be simple but meaningful, reflecting the values that had brought Annie and Coulter together. No elaborate decorations or expensive entertainment, but good food, honest music, and the presence of people who understood the significance of what they were witnessing, not just the marriage of two individuals, but the continuation of something that had nearly been lost. Tom Henderson arrived with his family, followed by the Martinez clan and neighbors from ranches scattered across the valley. These were the people who had supported their fight against the railroad's acquisition plans, who had shared legal research and moral support during the months when the future had seemed uncertain. The railroad had indeed agreed to the easement arrangements Annie had proposed, running their spur line along the eastern boundary of the ranches without disrupting the agricultural operations that depended on the land. The solution satisfied everyone. The railroad got its access to the mountain mining operations. The ranchers kept their farms, and the territorial government avoided a protracted legal battle that could have set uncomfortable precedents. But more importantly for Annie and Coulter, the crisis had revealed the depth of their partnership and their shared commitment to preserving what mattered most. Working together to save Red Hollow Ranch had shown them that they were stronger as a team than either could be alone, and that their love was built on the solid foundation of mutual respect and common purpose. Pastor Williams arrived from town, carrying the worn leather Bible that had served for baptisms, weddings, and funerals throughout the territory for more than 20 years. He was a practical man who understood that ranch life didn't accommodate elaborate ceremonies, and he had agreed to perform the wedding outdoors, where the land itself could serve as their cathedral. As the guests assembled in the yard, Coulter emerged from the barn, wearing his best suit, the same one he had worn to marry Sarah 15 years earlier, but cleaned and pressed until it looked almost new. The sight of him standing beneath the cottonwood tree that his grandfather had planted caused a stir of appreciation among the gathered women, who recognized a man who had learned to carry himself with quiet dignity despite the hardships life had brought him. Pete Garrison, serving as best man, stood beside Coulter with obvious pride in his weathered face. In the months since the crisis with the railroad, Pete had watched his employer transform from a man going through the motions of living into someone who had rediscovered purpose and joy. The change had been gradual but unmistakable, and Pete understood that Annie deserved credit for helping Coulter find his way back to happiness. When Annie appeared on the porch, escorted by Tom Henderson in the absence of her own family, a murmur of appreciation rose from the assembled guests. She moved with the same quiet grace that had characterized her work in the wheat fields, but today that grace was enhanced by the radiance that came from complete happiness. As she walked toward Coulter across the yard where they had worked together through crisis and triumph, Annie carried in her hands the new wedding ring that would replace the memorial he had worn for 5 years. The gesture was symbolic, not an erasure of the past, but a declaration that love could grow again in soil that had been enriched by previous joy and watered by honest grief. The ceremony itself was brief but deeply moving. Pastor Williams spoke of love that was built on shared labor and tested by adversity, of partnerships that strengthened both individuals while creating something greater than the sum of their separate parts. When Coulter and Annie exchanged vows they had written themselves, their words reflected the mature understanding of people who had learned that true commitment meant choosing each other not just in moments of passion, but in the daily work of building a life together. When Coulter slipped the new wedding ring onto Annie's finger, he removed his own memorial band and handed it to Pete for safekeeping, not as a rejection of his love for Sarah, but as an acknowledgement that the time for looking backward had ended and the time for moving forward had begun. The celebration that followed lasted until well after sunset, filled with music from instruments that neighbors had brought from their own homes and dancing that spilled from the makeshift floor onto the packed earth of the ranch yard. Children ran between the adults, their laughter adding to the joy that seemed to emanate from every corner of the gathering. As the evening wound down and guests began the journey back to their own homes, Annie and Coulter found themselves alone on the porch, where they had shared so many conversations during the long summer evenings. The wheat fields stretched before them in the moonlight, peaceful and secure under their care. "No regrets?" Coulter asked, his arm around his new wife as they looked out over the land they would tend together. "Only that it took me 3 years of wandering to find my way here," Annie replied, her hand resting over his heart. "But maybe I needed those years to become someone worthy of what we've built together." The new wedding ring on her finger caught the moonlight, its simple gold band reflecting the honest beauty of love that had grown from respect, deepened through shared struggle, and been blessed by the understanding that some things were worth any effort to preserve. Red Hollow Ranch had been saved, but more than that, it had become the foundation for a future that honored the past while embracing the possibilities that lay ahead. In the distance, the wheat rustled in the night breeze, whispering of harvests to come and the continuing cycle of seasons that would mark their years together. Love, after all, had indeed grown where even strong men fall, rooted in the rich soil of shared purpose and tended with the patient care that transforms hope into lasting joy.